Bom dia a todos. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de cada um de vocês. Este é um evento inaugural, primeira Conferência Internacional Aberta do nosso Centro de Pesquisa Política e Social. E eu gostaria, neste momento, de registrar a presença da professora Karina Mariano, que é assessora da Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa da Unesp, está aqui representando o nosso pró-reitor, professor Edson Botelho, e é uma das principais responsáveis também por esse evento, porque ela é a líder do módulo Jean Monnet, Unesp, e que possibilitou o financiamento da vinda do professor Michael Wilkinson para o Brasil. Agradeço também a presença do professor Marcelo Mariano, que é o coordenador do nosso Centro de Pesquisa em Política Social, ao professor José Duarte Neto, nosso docente de Direito Constitucional, parceiro de muitas pesquisas. Em nome do Márcio, assessor da vice-diretoria, agradeço a toda a equipe da universidade que apoia a organização deste evento, que está sendo gravado para posterior disponibilização também no canal do YouTube da faculdade para aqueles que não puderam acompanhar. E agradeço muito especialmente a cada um de vocês que estão aqui presentes. A palestra vai durar em torno de 1h15, depois teremos mais cerca de 45 minutos para perguntas e respostas. Inicialmente eu não farei nenhuma, eu convidarei o professor Duarte, a professora Karina e o professor Marcelo, e abriremos para todos aqueles que estiverem interesse. Eu peço que as perguntas sejam perguntas e não mini palestras, né? O mais objetivas possível, para que o máximo de pessoas consiga partilhar deste momento. Welcome, Professor Michael Wilkinson. We are very happy to receive you in Brazil. I remember when you talked on January 24 about this possibility, and you said to me that this year is not possible, but maybe sometime in the future. And fortunately, you are with us today at Unesp with a very hard work, a lot of meetings, discussions, but we intend to enjoy as much as possible the opportunity to talk with you on material constitution, on authoritarian liberalism, and other topics. Professor Michael Wilkinson, he is a professor of law at the Law School of Economics and Political Science. He studied at the University College London, the College of Europe in Bruges, and completed a PhD at the European University Institute in Florence. Prior to taking up his post in LSA in 2007, Mike was a lecturer at Manchester University, EU-US Fulbright Research Fellow at Columbia and NYU, and was called to Bar Lincoln's Inn in 2000. He has also taught at Cornell University as adjunct professor of law and being a visiting professor at Université Panthéon-Assas Paris II, National University of Singapore, and Keio University of Tóquio, and now at Unesp. Welcome. Please, you have the podium.
Obrigado. Bom dia. I'm sorry for my Portuguese, so I will rather speak in English. I hope you can understand me. We have some time for questions, so we can explain some concepts, some ideas. Can everybody hear me? You can hear me at the back? Excellent. Okay, so it's a huge pleasure to be here. And I would like to say firstly thank you to Professor Murilo Gasparo for the invitation, to Unesp for the organization, and for being such wonderful hosts. It's really a great pleasure to be here and an honor to be here. And thank you so much for coming to the lecture. And it's difficult to get a big crowd of people at 9 o'clock in the morning. so thank you. Obrigado for coming. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the material constitution, and I'm going to talk about the material constitution as a method of constitutional inquiry, a way to study constitutional law, which takes seriously not only the constitutional text, but the materiality of law. And I will try and explain what that means, what it means to take seriously the material constitution. But law is not just the law in the books, it's a law in action. It's the law which functions, and sometimes it doesn't function, and we have to ask why it functions, why it doesn't function, where it comes from. Why is a constitution in Brazil different from the constitution in France? Or why is a constitution in America different from the constitution in the United Kingdom? These questions require some deeper analysis into the structures, the institutions, but also we say, I say we because I made this with a co-author, Marco Goldoni, an Italian scholar. We say that we have to look at the social relations which are underlying constitutional development. And this can be understood in different ways. There is the classic example of class conflict. There are also ways of channeling class conflict into political institutions. Institutions themselves are part of a series of conflicts between courts and legislatures, between the executive branch and the judicial branch, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk about the material constitution in the first half of my lecture, and and some implications of the material constitution. And in the second half, I'm going to apply the idea to the specific case of Europe. Okay. So first, this is the cover of the book, which depicts this landscape, the first modern landscape according to the description of the painting. The painting is Bruegel, the Harvesters, from 1565. And we see already that this image presents the human being in relation with their reproduction, the work of labor, the work of the land, the creation of the possibility of life begins in material factors. Yeah, it begins with the reproduction of society. Let me just quote from, actually, I can only just read it's difficult for me to, that's better, yeah, now I can see, otherwise I can't see the slide. This was described as the first modern landscape. The religious pretext for landscape painting has been suppressed in favor of a new humanism, and the unidealized description of the local scene is based on natural observations. This is the description of the painting which hangs in the Met Gallery in New York. So we are moving away from the religious pretext and towards the sense of humanity creating its own conditions, already in 1565. So we wanted this cover for the book to express the significance of the material environment for understanding how a social order becomes a constitutional order. And so we can have the next slide. So in the theoretical reconstruction of the material constitution, we offer an analysis which has 4 layers or 4 levels of analysis. The material constitution, the definition of the material constitution is the set of elements that reproduces a social order as a constitutional order. How does a society become a constitution? And we say there are 4 layers. The first is political unity. There is some sense of the Constitution representing a unity of people. Okay? Now, this itself is often contested. So you have, for example, in a federal state, you have a contest between the center and the parts. You also have, particularly in Europe, secessionist movements that want to leave the unity of the state. You think about Catalonia in Spain or the Basque Country in Spain. So this is not straightforward. Often it's complex and it's contested. But any constitution requires a degree of political unity. Secondly, it requires a set of institutions that are capable of translating social material into political material. In other words, you need political parties, you need legislators, you need formal institutions as well as informal institutions. Again, there is conflict among these institutions, but there has to be some possibility for a constitution to function that the institutions themselves are capable of making a legal order. Then we go down a further level into the social relations of the society. In classic Marxism, this is understood as the conflict between labor and capital. Maybe we can update this class conflict for the contemporary period, and we will talk about that later. But whatever our view of the way in which social classes are divided, there has to be some social context for a constitution. We have to reproduce the social order. And so in order for politics to function, there has to be some way of channeling society into the formal institutional level. And so you have informal institutions like trade unions, political parties, social movements as well, which are the lifeblood of the Constitution. Those are the three levels of analysis. There is a fourth, which is a more intangible notion, a notion of political objectives. Every constitution makes explicit some objectives, some political objectives: equality, liberty, fraternity. Or it could be much more specific about the policies to create a health system or an education system. Political objectives will also be contested, often between political parties. But each constitution will have some aspect of a purpose or a set of purposes, which means that the Constitution is also forward-looking. It's aspiring to something, to achieve something more. But because of the need to examine the three layers, this aspiration may be thwarted. It may be impossible because it requires functioning institutions. It requires social relations that are relatively harmonious. And in the absence of that, the purposes will not be achievable. So this is the framework. And in the book, we have scholars from India, China, America, Europe, South America, all using this framework, this method, to better understand their own constitutions. I say at the very end of this slide that there is a fifth element which we want to include in the next edition of the book, which is the relationship with the natural environment. In a sense, this is our starting point with the picture of the workers on the land. The natural environment is often an implicit, an invisible feature of the Constitution, but we want to make this more explicit in the future. Okay, so what? So what does this framework mean? Well, I'm going to say something about the implications of using this tool. The implications, firstly, is that it means that there is always a space for critique of the existing Constitution. There is a gap between the formal Constitution, what the Constitution proclaims, and the material reality. Constitutions almost inevitably proclaimed to be democratic, to protect social rights, to defend freedom and equality. If we look at the reality underlying the Constitution, these claims are often shown to be false or misleading or spurious. So constitutions are relatively ideological instruments in the sense that the idea doesn't match the reality. This is the case with all constitutions. No constitution is completely identical with its reality. Some constitutions are so removed that we can say they are a sham constitution. And the material constitution gives us the possibility of explaining why some constitutions are relatively sham, because simply the material and the formal do not match up. There is so big a gap that is no longer credible to talk about a constitutional order. The second implication is that there are many silences in the formal constitution. There are many things that are not explained in the text, that are not explained even in the official interpretation of the text. So any constitutional inquiry has to look at the way those silences are filled in by legislation, by constitutional interpretation. Here, courts play an important role. Think about the way they use the principle of proportionality to make a balance of values. But that in itself is to give a certain power to the judiciary, which may be contested by the other branches or even by the people themselves. Executive powers often are not specified in the Constitution. And in the particular case that I examine in my book, I look at the European Central Bank and the Eurogroup. Through the Euro crisis, it became clear that there were institutions that were running the show which didn't even have a proper legal basis for their actions in the treaty. The Eurogroup was famously described as formally an informal group. What does it mean? Well, it means that powers are exercised with a lack of accountability, a lack of political accountability. Okay, I've already talked about political parties. I want to say just something about also some constitutional silences in relation to substantive issues. Think about slavery, which was a part of American life in the 19th and into the 20th century, about which the Constitution was silent. And there were even explicit judicial decisions to silence the issue of slavery. If we only looked at the Constitution, we would not understand the context in which that Constitution was functioning, or for many people, not functioning. More recently, again, to use the example of the Euro crisis, austerity became an implicit goal of the political economy of the Eurozone. The Greeks were told they would only be able to receive the financial assistance if they pursued a policy of austerity, cutting public services, privatizing public assets. None of this could be found in the text of the treaty, but it was pushed onto the Greek people because of the arrangement of powers, the institutional powers, but also that level of social relations, which became an open class conflict after the financial crisis between the bankers and the taxpayers. Okay, let me give you an example from the European history. La Costituzione della Repubblica Italiana from 1948. A moment in Italian history of great hope in many ways. After the disaster of the first half of the century, the Second World War, Italian fascism, This was a new beginning, a hope for a new beginning. Italy is a democratic republic founded on labor. Amedeo Bodega, the founder of the Italian Communist Party, collaborator with Antonio Gramsci, his response was yes, founded on the exploitation of labor. Sovereignty belongs to the people was also proclaimed by the Italian constitution. Only a few years later, Piero Calamandrei, an Italian anti-fascist resistance fighter, member of the Revolutionary Action Party during the Second World War, already lamented that behind the facade of a formal democracy lay the reality of continuities and compromises with fascism and the police state of Mussolini. In other words, even in those most ideological, aspirational moments of founding a new entity, we have to be aware of the reality underneath the facade. Okay, so also I should be aware how long I'm speaking because I get carried away. And I can talk for 5 hours, but I should try not to talk for 5 hours. So, I want to try and explain in a simplified manner why there is a gap between the reality and the aspiration. And here we have to go back in history. We can go back to the French Revolution, which proclaims the trinity of modern values: liberty, equality, fraternity. At the same time as an insistence by the emerging bourgeoisie of a protection of private property. So this conflict between the aspiration of the Constitution and the reality of a capitalist economy based on private property is a contradiction that is built in to the modern constitutional order. Thank you. Perfect. So if you can just... Yep. So freedom, yes, in the modern condition, the condition where we no longer believe that human actions are determined by divine will, we are free to make our own constitution. We are political animals. We are also equal. The republic is based on equality, which comes to include everyone. Of course, over struggles for women, struggles for minorities in the 200 years later. But the promise is made already with this French revolutionary claim. It's a polis. In other words, in the Greek sense, a polis is built on equality, not the house, not the oikos, not the household, which is built on hierarchy. And forms of solidarity. On the other hand, there is still this claim to private property, which frustrates the goals of liberty, equality, fraternity. And we can explain this with looking at the difference between Rousseau on the one hand and Sieyès on the other hand. So let me just quote from Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing before the French Revolution, one of the four runners of the radical tradition of republicanism. In his discourse on inequality, this is a quote from his work. The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him, that man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes, might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody." This is the original sin of the modern political order, the claim that this is mine. And Rousseau saw the perils of this claim. What would follow from this claim to private property would be the conflict, the wars, the murders, and so on. On the other hand, if we look at Sieyès, who develops the French revolutionary trajectory in order to overthrow the monarchy, believed in the claims, the material claims of the third estate. The third estate was the emerging commercial class that were excluded by the first and the second estates in the French Revolution. What is the third estate? Sieyès says everything. What has it been until now? Nothing. What will it become? Something. So for Sieyès, the new claim to represent the nation would be made by this emerging commercial class. Now, what does this difference mean? On the one hand, the claim to solidarity, the Rousseauian claim that we need some kind of socioeconomic equality, and Sieyès' claim that the commercial class is destined to rule the nation because of its economic power. This is from Antonio Negri, the Italian Marxist thinker of the last 20, 30 years. He notes that Sieyès' claim about the constituent power, the third estate being the constituent power, has the effect of inserting the question of labor into the weave of constituent power. Because even though Sieyès becomes, in effect, a counter-revolutionary against the claims of the lower classes, against the claims of the sans-culottes, the lower orders, nevertheless, he sees that the material conditions for constituting the nation are what is the constituent power to make the constitution. And as the revolution proceeds, Negri continues, the evolution of Sieyès' thought is entirely meant to establish further limits to the expression of constituent power. In other words, this representative of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, Sieyès is wary of having opened this revolutionary tide. What could be next? Well, Marx is next. Because what Marx sees is the sham nature of this claim. That it's not the middle class which is constituting the nation, but the laboring class which is constituting the nation. And Marx notices an important feature of political discourse, which is its difference from how it appears to how things really are. Things are not what they seem, or in Marx's words from volume 3 of Das Kapital, all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. If things were how they seemed, we wouldn't need science, we wouldn't need social science for sure. But it's not the case. Things are not how they seem. That's why we need analysis. That's why we need critical theory. That's why we need Marx. The most obvious example, with the example which drives the whole trajectory of Marxist thought in the next century, can be, I think, nicely illustrated by this duality of labor. Yes, in capitalism, the laborer, the worker, is free to sell their labor. They can commodify their labor on the market. For liberals, that's freedom. But Marx sees that it's not really freedom if you have to sell your labor, if you're forced to sell your labor to survive, to meet your basic needs. And moreover, that the profit of that labor is accumulated by somebody else. So, the Constitution is not what it seems. There is a material order underlying the formal order. There are tensions between them, conflicts between them. But there is also a space, a possibility of political action. So we mustn't reduce the Constitution merely to an economic formula. We need to remember that human beings are capable of changing their environment, changing their natural environment, but also changing their political environment. Institutions are created, institutions are changed by virtue of our action, our political action. And so we have to remember that a material constitution is also a process of constituting something bigger. Yeah, the gap between the real and the formal constitution also means that we can try to represent in a different way the society and change that society through politics. To reproduce a social order is a material question. In classic Marxist terminology, it requires analysis of the forces and relations of production. But to represent a social order is a political question, in the sense captured by the concept of the political, in the terminology of the French theorists, le politique, and not la politique. Le politique is the political, not just different politics or policies, but the very question of the political, which means the question of human action, human political action that is capable of staging a new theater, if you like, a new scene. This signals the autonomy of the political realm. That political action is determined neither by divine intervention nor by material forces as a matter of straightforward cause and effect. In other words, the material constitution does not determine political action, it conditions political action. It makes some things more likely, some things more possible. It means it's not entirely contingent, but neither is it purely determined. And here we need to combine Marx with Hannah Arendt, a scholar or theorist of the human condition in a more political manner. The fact that man is capable of action means that the unexpected can be expected from him, that he is able to perform what is infinitely improbable. Part of the human condition for Hannah Arendt is precisely based on plurality, the fact that each of us is different, the fact that men and women, not man, inhabits the earth. This means that politics is always essential to negotiate the differences, to create new possibilities, to create new constitutions. Okay. So we began with the French Revolution. We included the essential aspect of Marx in the 19th century, Hannah Arendt in the 20th century, and now we can start to historicize this arc of history, this story, this narrative of constitutional change. Because in the 20th century, the idea of the material constitution disappears to some extent. This is why we try to resurrect it, to bring it back. But we also explain why it disappears. The material constitution disappears. To some extent, also the revolutionary idea of the constituent power disappears, particularly in Europe. And here we have to start to be more sensitive to context to some extent. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. But the dominant mode of constitutional analysis becomes this very strange mixture of Hans Kelsen and Carl Schmitt, who were antagonists in the Weimar period. Perhaps some of you are familiar with Kelsen? Yeah, okay, good. Schmitt? Also, okay, perfect. So Kelsen and Schmitt were antagonists in Weimar. Schmitt was a conservative, reactionary figure, a counter-revolutionary figure who became a fascist when the Nazis came to power. Kelsen was a moderate, liberal, let's say in the European sense of the term, and a formal legal philosopher who reduced the material constitution to the norms of the constitution-making powers, reduced ultimately to the basic norm, the Grundnorm, which means that for Kelsen, the foundation of a constitution is an act of thought, a presupposition. The complete opposite of what we want to say by introducing the material constitution. It's an entirely formal notion. Schmitt, on the other hand, insists on this existential notion of the constitution as representing the identity of the society. But this is counter-revolutionary, reactionary, trying to conserve the existing order, precisely against the threat from the left, as Schmitt sees the prospect of socialism, either democratic socialism or revolutionary socialism. And so the combination of these two dominant authors is to make constitutional law very conservative in nature, combined into this idea of constitutional identity. The notion that we can identify some kind of core features of the Constitution which are unchangeable. This is a highly conservative notion with a small c. I mean, conservative precisely because it wants to try and conserve the existing status quo. But this becomes guarded by institutions of an elite nature. In the case of Kelsen, the Constitutional Court. In the case of Schmitt, the presidential dictatorship, which can use emergency powers in order to arrest constitutional change, to prevent constitutional change. So the very idea of the social relations are gone. The idea of class conflict is gone. The idea of the revolutionary change of the constituent power is gone. And this brings me to the end of the first part of the lecture. I wonder whether to stop for questions now or continue till the end. To continue? Okay. So let me talk now a little bit about some of the applications of the material constitution. How do we apply this idea? And to apply the idea, we have to become a bit more sensitive to context, to particular local history. And I'm going to talk now about Europe, and we can maybe debate how much this is relevant to other parts of the world. The dominant narrative in constitutional theory in the 20th century is that after the Second World War, Europe is constructed as a liberal democracy. In my book, Authoritarian Liberalism and the Transformation of Modern Europe, I argue quite the contrary, that in fact, post-war Europe is constructed against the march of the masses onto the stage of history, against the emergence of mass democracy, of universal suffrage, of parties representing the working class, of radical parties that wanted to supersede the liberal order and develop a more emancipatory socialism. In other words, the dominant trajectory of post-war constitutionalism is counter-revolutionary. That's my argument in the book. Now, in order to sustain this argument, I begin with the interwar period, when, as Karl Polanyi shows, liberals turn towards authoritarianism in order to protect private property, to protect their individual interests. To the point where, in Polanyi's assessment, this lays the ground for fascism itself. To quote from Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, which is published even before the Second World War is ended, 1944, the stubbornness with which economic liberals supported authoritarianism resulted in a decisive weakening of the democratic forces which might have otherwise averted the fascist catastrophe. In other words, precisely the democratic forces that could have fought against fascism were weakened by liberal elites, by the center parties, by other establishment institutions. On the other hand, the liberals' own assessment of this was very different, as you might imagine. Captured by this meeting in 1938 of the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. Some of these figures also you may be familiar with. Von Hayek, probably you're familiar with. Von Mises, another Austrian economic liberal. Some German ordo-liberals, Rostov and Rupke, Louis Rougier, Raymond Aron, Robert Marjolin, Jacques Rueff. These are figures that were important in the founding of the project of European integration after the Second World War. And they took the opposite lesson from Polanyi. They thought liberalism needed to be defended more robustly to protect it from democracy. Unfortunately, their ideas became dominant, not the ones of Polanyi. I say unfortunately because I don't have time to go into it, but in my view, Polanyi's assessment was much more correct. But in the historical narrative, this is the story that becomes the dominant one, that neoliberalism. And here we can already talk about neoliberalism much earlier than we commonly assume. Neoliberalism is often dated to the 1970s or the 1980s, but in fact, already in the late 1930s, these group called themselves neoliberal because they saw that liberalism, laissez-faire liberalism, classic liberalism had failed, and they wanted, in order to protect the interests of the middle class and the property owners, to restore liberalism on a new footing, hence the birth of neoliberalism. In post-war Europe, then, the material constitution is already created with this goal in mind, to weaken democracy and to strengthen liberalism. At the time, this was already noted by critical theorists, intellectuals associated with the Frankfurt School. Franz Neumann in 1953, who has emigrated from Germany to America during the interwar and Second World War period, looks at the scene in post-war Europe and notices that citizens are becoming increasingly alienated from political power. If we think about the layers of the material constitution, there is an attempt to unify Europe itself through creating some kind of federation or quasi-federal union. There is a move away from parliaments towards courts, towards experts, towards technocrats, a decline of parliamentary authority. Political parties become what Kirchheimer, another Frankfurt School theorist, calls catch-all parties. They try and appeal to everyone, not only their core constituencies. Christian democracy becomes hegemonic, the center-right formation. Economic freedom takes the place of political freedom. Class struggle is abandoned by the socialist parties. Even the radical left-wing parties abandon the idea of the revolutionary constituent power and become more moderate Euro-communist parties. In terms of the political objectives, remember the fourth layer of the material constitution, Europe is built around the hope for peace, prosperity, and ever closer union amongst the peoples of Europe, but in a way which is entirely passive on the part of the European peoples themselves. It's an elite-driven project. The classic case of this elite view of democracy is the German one. Not we are the people, but we are afraid of the people. Power moves away from the popular arenas to constitutional courts and executive branches. Constitutional discourse is depoliticized. There is, to quote the German constitutional scholar Christoph Müllers, the complete legalization of constituent power. The very notion of constituent power becomes one that is owned by the courts, by the lawyers, no longer the people. Neumann describes this as a constitutional fetishism, a fetish of the Constitution. This picture is, I gave this talk last year in Germany, in Cologne. This is my most unfriendly audience, usually the German one. So this is the second, the poster which I saw as I was walking to the university in Cologne, in Germany. Unser Grundgesetz ist ein Leuchtturm der Freiheit und Democracy. This worshipping of the Constitution as a symbol of freedom and democracy, at the same time as the court itself is a highly anti-democratic institution. Critical theory itself becomes removed from the idea of mass politics. Jürgen Habermas, who is the leading figure of the Frankfurt School in the second generation, argues after 1989, after the end of the Soviet Union, to quote him, "It has become impossible to break out of the universe of capitalism. The only remaining option is to civilize and tame the capitalist dynamic from within." In other words, even critical theorists give up this struggle against the possibility of some alternative to the capitalist way of organizing the economy. This is the surrender of critical theory. The EU becomes seen as a stepping stone to the constitution of a world society. And in this period of the early 2000s, this is when I'm a PhD student in Italy, the discourse is about post-nationalism, post-sovereignty, post-politics. Everything is postmodern. Yeah, but all of this really means that there is no longer democracy. This is post-democracy in reality. There is a mismatch between the system, which is increasingly upscaled to the supranational level, and the life world, which remains local, which remains national. This is the French no to the constitutional treaty in 2005 in a referendum. The French vote against the constitutional treaty, and yet 3 years later, the treaty is repackaged and sold back to them as the Lisbon Treaty, and it becomes the binding document. Habermas himself becomes closer to Macron, the centrist political formations, which are the perfect embodiment of an authoritarian liberalism, a political authoritarianism combined with the defense of economic liberalism. Okay, so who are the saviors in this story? Who are the possible people who have maintained a degree of criticism of the existing setup. Not just a criticism, because everyone can be critical sometimes of this or that, but really critique in the sense of going to the root of the problem. Well, I picked one example for a positive case. Etienne Balibar, the French Marxist scholar, who saw what was happening already in the early 2000s as the European elites were becoming increasingly remote from the people. And he describes this as the absolute blockage of the question of the people understood as constituent political power. The impasse of sovereignty in Europe referred to the absolute blockage of the question of the constituent power. In other words, there is no possibility, it seemed, to generate some kind of constituent project. Then in the Euro crisis phase, I already mentioned the rise of austerity, the European Central Bank, the Eurogroup. This signaled, in his view, a revolution from above. Yeah? The elites pursue their own revolution, changing the structure of the material constitution by altering the balance of power between society and state, economics and politics, by depoliticizing economic issues, by disempowering the people, empowering the state, empowering the market, but disempowering the constituent power. So the autonomy of the political, to return to the point I made earlier, has to be understood as a material struggle for equal liberty. This is Etienne Balibar's idea of égalité, equal liberty. Liberty must not be a simply formal notion. It must be understood that freedom has to be for all and has to be effective. And he also notes that in the context of a capitalist economy, this will mean a continual conflict, a tension between democracy on the one hand and capitalism on the other. And in the Euro crisis response, this asymmetry was evident, that the interests of capital were being protected and the interests of democracy were being threatened. When the Greek people tried a movement from the left in the form of the Syriza party, an anti-austerity party, they managed to maintain, to generate an ochi. In Greek, ochi means no, to the memoranda negotiated with the Troika. And yet, they had to sign, in the end, an even harsher set of conditionality. This is a coup, was the hashtag on Twitter when Tsipras was forced to capitulate. Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission at the time, said there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. In the center of the picture, you have this series of what I would say are authoritarian liberal actions and rhetorics. Draghi, the president of the ECB, pursuing these highly dubious policies in order to sustain the system. And Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, insisting that if the euro failed, the currency failed, Europe fails. And Macron himself turning to increasing authoritarian measures in the French political scene in order to avert opposition. And on the right, the emergence of new populism in the form of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is dismissed by the liberal elites at the same time as embraced by them. There is a talk of anti-populism, but liberal anti-populism is shallow. It's not serious. At the same time, always emulating the rhetoric of the right, as in the case of von der Leyen, talking about protecting a European way of life against immigrants or against outsiders. Exactly the rhetoric of the right. So the center is always asymmetrical in its response, crushing the left and imitating the right. Yeah, this is the trajectory of the contemporary period. Should I continue further? Yeah? Okay. I want to make sure that we have some time for discussion, but I think we get there. I think I only have maybe 5 or 6 more slides. So, okay. So, a second set of observations, now which is more speculative on my part. This is referring now to new research that I'm doing in an attempt to go beyond Europe and think about the international system, the global system of capital, thinking about core and periphery, the problems that poses for trying to make new politics in the global south or elsewhere in the world. And I draw on an Egyptian political economist, Samir Amin, who wrote a wonderful book in French in the 1980s called Eurocentrism. It was only translated into English 20 years later. Samir Amin was an important figure, not only an intellectual, but also a political leader of the non-aligned movement in the post-war era, the Bandung principles of those countries that were neither with Washington nor with Moscow. So he has a biography which is very interesting, not just an intellectual, but someone who was participating in the debates, the political debates at the time. And he has this notion which is very helpful, which is modernity critical of itself. In other words, we don't need to abandon entirely the principles of modernity, but we can understand them to be able to reflect on their own incompleteness. And I want to illustrate what that means. So, Samir Amin elaborates on these 2 periods, which we've already talked about in the first half of this lecture. First is the Enlightenment period itself, the French Revolution and its launching of this idea of emancipation, secularism, the capacity to begin anew. And yet it also launches the project of capitalism in domestic as well as imperial form. In the 19th century is the era of imperialism, when European powers are accumulating capital across the globe. Amin notices that there is a second phase of modernity, which is precisely signaled by Marx, which shows that emancipation is not possible within the constraints of the capitalist economy. But Marx himself is part of modernity. It's not a rejection of modernity. It's the possibility of modernity being self-critical. That, for example, the promise of liberty and equality is not fulfilled. Nothing wrong with the promise. The problem is with the concrete application of the promise, the failure to fulfill the promise. And so we need Marxism to illustrate that gap, but also because Amin now is writing in the 1960s, 1970s, and understanding that historical materialism has to become global to take account of the expansion of capital across the globe and the creation of core and periphery centers which are unequal in their relations among one another. Let me quote from Eurocentrism, which is the book that I mentioned by Samir Amin. Rather than bring about a homogenization of the societies of the planet on the basis of the European model, conquest progressively created a growing polarization at the heart of the system. crystallizing the capitalist world into fully developed centers, and peripheries incapable of closing the ever-widening gap. In other words, for Amin, Eurocentrism is not just an ideology, it's a reality. It's the reality of European powers being able to dominate the world and creating a system of dependency between the center and the periphery, which is incapable of being overthrown within the existing system, because the system is precisely created to maintain that inequality. So Amin, who developed, is one of the inventors, one of the originators of dependency theory, argues both that the center-periphery polarization is impossible to overcome within capitalism, but also, and this is a key point, that it incorporates the domestic elites into the system. The domestic elites in the periphery become themselves part of a hegemonic class. Yeah. So it's not simply a case of core versus periphery, because the periphery itself develops a hierarchy within which capitalism is embedded. But the need for Amin would be to delink, in some respects, that global economy through making alliances in the global south. In other words, his project is a project not of globalism, but of internationalism, of international solidarity as a means to temper the capitalist dynamic, to tame the capitalist dynamic, and maybe even to overcome it in some more emancipatory moment. Okay, so we reached the conclusion. We've talked about theory, we've talked about the material constitution, we've talked about history, the arc of the material constitution, the way that in some periods it becomes more evident, in some periods it becomes more invisible. This has to do with crises of capitalism, which are periodic, crisis of global capitalism, which emerged most recently after the global financial crisis. And now we have, in constitutional law, one book after another on the crisis of rule of law, how to save constitutional democracy, what is populism, constitutional democracy in crisis, how democracies die. These are just some of the recent hundreds of books in the last 10 years on this now apparently global problem of the decline of liberal democracy. In my view, any analysis which ignores the crisis of capitalism will only ever be incomplete and also highly misleading if it ignores this fundamental conflict at the heart of the system, which is the conflict between democracy and capitalism. And so we need to think about the crisis as one's not just of democracy, but of democratic capitalism. In thinking now about putting together some of the pieces and offering, this is a simplified model or a snapshot of the problem of globalization, which I've applied here to European integration. Danny Roderick, who created this trilemma of globalization, says you can have globalization, or in my application, European integration and national sovereignty, but then you surrender democracy. This is effectively the situation through the Euro crisis. Or you can have national sovereignty and democracy, but that means some kind of exit, in this case from the European Union, in another case, in the global case, from the global system of capitalism. But then you have to abandon globalization, or you have to abandon, in this case, European integration. The third option, which is favored by Habermas and probably most liberal left intellectuals, is to democratize the European Union. But in my view, this is simply implausible for the material reasons that I've explained, democracy is and has to begin from the ground up. It has to be local. It has to be built on social movements. Those simply don't exist at the European level, never mind the global level. And so the only plausible route or rupture from the existing system is some kind of exit from the current path of integration. And finally, what does this mean? Because whenever I do this talk or a similar version, the fear is that breaking from the system is to return to nationalism. But Amin's project shows exactly that there is an alternative, which is internationalism, which is not Eurocentric. Neither is it based upon some dreams about global order, which are, in my view, either a nightmare or totally utopian in the worst sense of the word, that the most plausible solution is an international one, in which the project of repoliticization has to be at the heart of it. Politics, not violence. This is again to quote Hannah Arendt, politics is the opposite of violence. Democratic sovereignty is the only plausible channel through which that could be realistically achieved. And so the antidote to the poison, if you like, is repoliticizing the society through projects of democracy, through projects of democratic sovereignty, through projects of representation. And there I will finish. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Mike. I'd like to invite to take your seats in this table, Professor Karina Mariano, please. As I've said, she's here as an advisor at the Vice Presidents for Research of our university and representing the Vice President. She's also an important political scientist in our university. I would also to invite Professor Marcelo Mariano, the leader of our Center for Political and Social Research. I would like to highlight that this center is recently established at our university with a very good infrastructure for research, including not just hardware but software, and the leadership of Professor Marcelo, and now some technical support to conduct the research using technology, the digital humanities, and it's open for everyone. And in addition to this infrastructure, we have a monthly meeting called Science with Coffee. It's a meeting designated to share our research topics and to find a common topic to present it to research foundations. And also we are organizing some lectures, national, international lectures, and this one is the first one of our center. I would like finally to invite to take his seat, Professor, please, José Duarte, please take your seat. It's better for the picture. Professor José Duarte, our Professor of Constitutional Law. I will give the microphone for you three to make three small comments and one question for Professor Michael. And then I will invite the Professor Michael to reply, to comment, and then sometimes for some Q&A for our audience.
I begin? Can I talk? Well, Michael, I want to hear you a concrete example of authoritarian liberalism, more to understand better what you said in theoretical terms, right?
Should I have the
You first.
Oh, of course.
Bom. Hello, good morning to everyone. I want to congratulate Professor for this speech, for this lecture, and thank you to come to Franca. First, I think in two questions. It's a surprise for me to find a professor in United Kingdom that talk with a jurist from the civil law, Mortati, Heller, Carl Schmitt, and others professors. If I've understood your speech, the material constitution is the essence, not only methodological understand, but the essence, a concrete, a real concept of the real, not organization of power, but the relation of the real, the conception of constitution. For me, it's clear, or what I have understood. I have one problem, and or some problems that you have pointed on the end of your lecture. The problem of the crisis in democracy. If I have understood your speech, the constitutional, the material constitution have 4 elements: unity, unit institutions, social relations, and theological means.
Political objectives.
Yes, political objects. Considering institutional conditions, how can you understand the material constitution in the context of the global phenomenon of autocratization? Because these autocratizations operate in oppositions of institutions, or a personal figure, the populist, acting against the institutions. And the other problem, if I have understood, the comprehension of social relations is like a Heller social relations, or the search for homogeneity, a social homogeneity, or a ethical homogeneity. How to understand social homogeneity or ethical homogeneity in a context of culture war, extreme polarization, and when this idea is replaced by the conception of friend and enemy by Carl Schmitt. I was clear? Thank you.
Thank you. I will begin with some words to the audience in Portuguese. I'm sorry. É um prazer estar aqui representando a Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa. Eu acho que essa iniciativa do Centro de Pesquisa em Humanidades é muito importante, né? É reconhecido pela reitoria como uma iniciativa importante, principalmente porque ela congrega vários cursos, não é uma iniciativa de uma área, mas sim de uma atividade interdisciplinar, e isso é muito importante, né? E por isso o prestígio estar aqui hoje, participando desse primeiro evento oficial, né? Porque eu sei que o café já tem ocorrido há algum tempo, mas um evento oficial, e dizer que tem todo o apoio da Pró-Reitoria de Pesquisa nessa iniciativa, e que vocês precisarem, podem entrar em contato conosco, estamos lá para apoiar e ajudar no que for preciso. Now, Professor Mike, very interesting your presentation, and I was wondering who will represent this material constitution, because normally parties and labor unions were the actors that represent these values, these interests of this society. But in this case, they are part of the system, the capitalist system. So, in this case, who represents? And I'm thinking about Tocqueville when he's very smart when he says, when the system is working, nobody cares. And what I see now is that dilemma. Society is not interested. And the speech is now not more rules or more representative rules, but flexibilization, less rules, less constitution. You understand? And I'm thinking, who will represent these new values? Who can struggle against the system? That's my question now. Thank you. Very interesting, your presentation.
Thanks. So let me start with the first one. So the idea of authoritarian liberalism, which I document in this book, combines political authoritarianism with economic liberalism. I mean, hundreds of examples. Let me start maybe with the origin, which is in Weimar Germany, just before the Nazi seizure of power. Hermann Heller, looking at the situation, describes it as authoritarian liberalism because the president is using emergency powers to bypass parliament, to clamp down on political dissent. Clearly, in his view, this was authoritarian because it's anti-democratic. Why is it liberal? Because it's trying to maintain the market economy, the liberal market economy. Essentially, it's trying to use emergency power or emergency politics to maintain the economic system. That's why he calls it authoritarian liberalism. Now, in the book, I say, yes, there are many examples of this in the crisis moment. So for another example I give in the book is the power of the European Central Bank, which is used in a way which is completely divorced from democracy. So in my view, it's authoritarian because it's undemocratic. But it's intended to maintain this project of the single currency, which is a project of economic liberalism. So there are moments of crisis where the institutions, some you mentioned autocracy as well, will use, sometimes in explicitly in the Constitution itself gives avenues for using emergency, dictatorial powers, sometimes more informally, in ways which are attempting to protect the interests of private property, of free markets. This is why this combination of authoritarian and liberalism. But I also think, and this goes a little bit to your question as well, that there is a more passive form of authoritarian liberalism, which is when there is a retreat away from politics. A passive form because actually the elites don't even always need to use emergency powers. They can simply use the existing system, which, for example, leaves a lot of space for that kind of action, which is not strictly speaking emergency action, but is enabled by virtue of the retreat of the representation. Yeah, I talked about the de-radicalization of the left, the abandonment of class struggle. All of this leaves the masses without proper political representation. So you can have a form of authoritarianism because we are simply quiet or passive. This is another form of authoritarianism which is more subtle. But I think this is also an example of authoritarian liberalism. Just more specifically, I agree, autocratization often operates against the institutions of representative democracy. This is why this second layer of the material constitution is both formal institutions like legislatures and courts, also executive branches, as well as informal or semi-formal institutions like the police and the trade unions, so on. So you can have a different balance of powers among the institutions. And you can have an imbalance of powers among the institutions, which gives rise to social protest, social conflict. Heller, when he talked about social homogeneity, he doesn't mean cultural necessarily. In fact, he says this can be a highly misleading form of homogeneity because it can be used to conceal inequality by appealing to national culture. So he's very careful to say that homogeneity means some degree of socioeconomic equality, which is precisely what is missing in the system of liberal market economy. In fact, he says that it's not only missing, it's also masked because the liberal system proclaims to be based on formal equality, whereas the reality is that it's based on an increasing inequality between capital and labor. Of course, the rhetoric can be captured by the right, and so culture can take the place of material questions, as in the case of Schmidt, who ultimately reduces politics to friend and enemy. But this is no longer politics. This is then polemics. This is war, ultimately. So it's important to maintain the element of social relations as being based in a material division of labor and not only appealing to culture. Who will represent the material constitution? This is a great question. I think we see in moments of crisis that there are attempts to represent this question, represent the material constitution. We saw it, I mentioned the Greek crisis in the case of the rise of Syriza, Oji. In Spain, we had Podemos, which grew out of the social movements of the squares, as a popular movement, became a political party. So I think there is an appetite for it. Recently in the UK, there is a new political party, Your Party it's called. It started only a few weeks ago, and now there are 700,000 people who have signed up. So there is appetite for a different way of doing politics. There is appetite for a more material politics that tackles social questions. There is the desire for it from below. The question is, how will it be organized? Of course, that's always a difficult question. And to what extent can it break through? To what extent can it really change the situation? And this also depends upon the material constitution, the existing material constitution. But I would disagree with Tocqueville. Because I would say, you say when the system is working, nobody cares. But when is the system really working for everybody? I don't think it ever did. The system is always working for some. So we have to always ask, in a sense, the Lenin question, whom? Who benefits for whom? Is this constitutional order, who really is represented by this constitutional order? Even in those moments of apparent tranquility, beneath the surface, there is discontent, there is inequality, and there is a desire for change, even when it looks as if things are relatively calm. In the crisis moment, then you see the light shines through and you see all of this undercurrents, which were there already, but because of the inability of the hegemonic system to maintain its hegemony, there is a possibility of alternatives, what Gramsci calls an organic crisis, when it's no longer capable of maintaining its grip on the status quo. But thank you for these great questions.
Thank you very much. And now I will invite someone to help me with this microphone, please. And we will receive 3 questions. But firstly, as I am the chair, I use this prerogative to make 2 questions to Professor Mike. And it's trying to relate the ideas of material constitutional and authoritarian liberalism to understand our reality. I know that you are not studying Brazil. But firstly, when you discuss, and these examples replying to Professor Marcelo on authoritarian liberalism, you use it to think on a supranational institution like the European Central Bank, or in the executive branch, or in the courts. But in Brazil, it's the hypothesis that we are trying to apply the concept. The branch that blockades any possibilities of social change is especially the legislative one. Is it authoritarian liberalism, a category, a concept that could be useful to understand a situation that the legislative power express some kind of authoritarian liberalism? And even in our history, it's just the executive leader that have been able to try to reform the tax system to be more, to have a just tax, or to reform the distribution of land, urban reform, or it's not a good category to understand what's happening with the Brazilian legislative branch. The second one is an idea from Klaus Hoff, who said in the 80s that capitalism and democracy could be compatible during the time that we had welfare state and the strongest social democratic parts, but you don't have it anymore. So what do you think about these questions? Capitalism and democracy would be never compatible. There is some hope for the political parties, new political parties, as you are presenting some sample here, or because we are discussing that the political party is the very important institution to understand the moment that the crisis of democracy is in some sense confunded, mixed with the crisis of the political parties. Please, some hands who will. One, I will give the microphone. 1, 2, 3, 4. First, he will answer me, and then Did you see, Luana? Yes.
Do you want me to answer your question first? Okay, so is authoritarian liberalism always supranational? No. Because the very first example that I give is from Weimar Germany.
By the president, and not by the legislative branch.
By the president acting through decrees and diktats, using emergency powers under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution in order to rule without a parliament. So this is a national, it begins in the nation state. And even where I mentioned the examples that I mentioned, like with the Euro crisis, it's not that this is Europe acting without the elites of the national states. This is a system which is always dependent upon local elites. So it's not that the ECB is acting, for example, completely independently of the national elites. That's an important point, that European integration is not some foreign imposition. It's the way that the state is constructed domestically. Macron is a good example, I think, of authoritarian liberalism also at the domestic level, within the European Union, using the powers of the French Constitution in order to make states of emergency, to make, for example, the arresting of terrorist subjects, to abandon the free movement on the border. All of this is done within the French state apparatus. So the European Union is not the root cause of this. But what the European Union does is to consolidate this authoritarian liberalism at the national level. It gives it this extra layer of impermeability. It makes it very difficult to have domestic elites accountable to the people, because they can always appeal to, well, we have to do this because of the EU or the ECB or the European Commission. So it makes an additional layer of unaccountable action. But it's the way authoritarian liberalism works is fundamentally at the national level. So in that sense, it could apply to Brazil, it could apply to the US, it could apply to Canada, it could apply anywhere. And in fact, one of the theorists who adopted the term before me was a Chilean scholar, Renato Cristi, who talked about it in the context of South America, and specifically the case of Pinochet, where there is a combination of political authoritarianism, in that case I think quite brutal authoritarianism, in defending the move to a market economy, supported by the Chicago School of Economics, supported by the theories of Hayek. So this was a very clear case, I think, of an authoritarian liberalism which acts much more violently than in the case of the European Union. The European Union is more of a soft kind of imposition of authoritarian liberalism. In terms of the legislature, that's quite a difficult one for me to answer, because I find it difficult to imagine this scenario. But it would depend upon whether the legislature is truly representative of the people it represents. If so, then I think it's not authoritarian. Maybe we don't like it. But if it's a legislature which generally represents the political will of the constituencies, and there is some real accountability between the legislature and the people, then by definition, I would say this is not authoritarian. But it requires really looking at how the system functions, whether it's a good democratic functioning or not.
It's fully captured by the economic power.
By the economic power, right? Then it can for sure be authoritarian. Yeah. Okay.
Professor, thank you for the conference. My name is Vinicius. I have a quick question. I'm sorry if I would insist on it, but why not global constitutionalism? Why not global constitutionalism? You bring the internationalism as the antidote, but sorry, I think, yeah. So... When it's thought about the material constitution and political unity, I understand it's difficult to think about a global unity, but wouldn't it be hard to internationally approaching it without this, even if minimal, unity? Thank you.
The next, this side, and then.
Well, in the first place, it's such an honor to us to receive you here. Some authors would say that we are living in a polycrisis time. Ambiental crisis, economic crisis, all crises feeding and increasing each other. You mentioned about the gap between the material constitution and the form constitution. My question, I would like to hear you about when the Constitutional Courts Act, very often you used to say that there's an increase of power of constitutional courts or a displacement of power. Could we not just see that this increase of power is just trying to make the gap smaller and smaller, or no? We made myself clear, or no?
Hi, I would like to thank you for coming here. And secondly, my question is a little bit specific, and I apologize if I talk nonsense, but I was wondering if the delay on the agreement between the Southern Common Market and the European Union could represent an example of Eurocentrism and the power dynamics between core countries and periphery countries, especially because France was one of the countries that was against the agreement and is a core country in the world and in the European Union. Thank you.
Which agreement you mentioned?
Sorry? Oh, yeah.
First of all, sorry for my broken English. And secondly, good morning, Professor Wilkinson. So I would like to ask a question regarding the difference between, not the difference, but regarding the material constitution and the formal constitution. So I would like to know what's the most effective way to close the gap that you mentioned. You did say we could use ways of closing the gap through the political actions, but I would like you to be more specific. Does it come from the political masses, or does it necessarily has to be from the top, like the elite or the upper classes?
I would like to know, in your view, how does the Russian-Ukrainian war is changing the political landscape of the European Union?
Vai responder, depois seguimos. Já são 5.
Okay. Okay, thanks for these great questions. Global constitutionalism, I'm afraid, is part of the problem and not the solution. And I think that is the case in a number of different ways. So firstly, if we think about global constitutionalism as establishing a set of obstacles to democratic change, then this is in itself part of the authoritarian framework. Secondly, the very talk about global constitutionalism often conceals that what it means is really US constitutionalism, exporting a model that is not necessarily good for other countries with very different, in very different situations. Also, it's part of an imperial project and part of this system, which I think would have to be dismantled in order to restore some true democratic agency. So in my view, not only global constitutionalism is a problem, constitutionalism is a problem. Global constitutionalism is a double problem. So I'm sorry. Okay, the poly-crisis and whether the Constitutional Court can, I think I understood your question, that how is it possible sometimes for constitutional courts to close this gap? Yeah, I'm very skeptical about the possibility of courts to really change the material constitution, even to change the balance of power among the institutions, which at least is plausible. But in order, for example, to fundamentally shift our social relations, our economic relations, the court doesn't have the power to do this. And more often than not, to the extent it has some power, it's rather a negative one, to prevent, for example, legislation which might be more progressive. I mean, this again is dependent upon the legislature, for sure. But there are contexts in which the Constitutional Court, in Europe at least, is rather a regressive institution. Let's take the very prominent principle in German constitutionalism of militant democracy. The Constitutional Court, for example, will ban parties, not only on the right, but also on the left, for, in the case of the German Communist Party, which was banned by the court in 1956 on the basis of interpreting the German constitution. So in my view, courts have a role, but the role must be very carefully circumscribed, because they are essentially a counter-majoritarian institution, deliberately so. But this immediately poses a democratic problem. Why should a court have the power to overturn a majority? It has to be very, it should only do so, I think, if at all, in very exceptional situation. So I'm not convinced that the court is the correct institution. The court is completely, for example, completely disconnected from the popular power, if you like. The second, or the third question on the issue of Eurocentrism and I mean, this is a difficult question, okay? So Europe, as we see, I think recently in the negotiations with Trump, is very weak. Remarkably so, given the economic size of the single market. It seems as if the European politicians are always speaking partly on their own behalf, partly on behalf of the European Union, and there's no real ability to coordinate some kind of response. So if anything, it seems as if the European Union doesn't make the countries stronger, but if anything, makes them weaker. This also is the case, I think, shown up now by, someone asked about the Ukraine war, the Russia-Ukraine war, on the impact of this on Europe. Of course, it's very soon to tell. But what this has done is generate a kind of European unity which is totally anti-democratic. This is not a unity based upon the generation of consent from below. It's a unity, it's the Schmittian unity, which is forged against the enemy. In this case, this enemy is supposed to be Russia. And so now we're supposed to unite on this basis. Uniting on the basis of an enemy will always mean an authoritarian response, because militarism is the most authoritarian response of all to our problems. So I'm skeptical about how this will unfold. It will rather, in my view, be a future problem for the European Union. So how do we? I missed the very important question from the gentleman about how do we close the gap? In a sense, this is the key question. But I would say, before we ask this question, we should ask: do we want to close the gap? Because it might well be actually that this constitutional text is not a text which we want to complete now, or at least in part. So if we think about some more aspirational provisions, possibly, but constitutions are also combinations of laws and norms and ideas, some of which we may not think are good ideas. That's certainly, I think, the case in most constitutions. Putting that question to one side, let's say we have a constitution and we think it's a good constitution and we want somehow to achieve it, then this has to come from below. It has to come from below precisely because of the dominance in the material constitution of social relations. So we start with political unity, then we look at institutions, but at the third level is the most fundamental, because this is the level which really reproduces society. Society is reproduced first and foremost materially. As Brecht said, erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Morality. First comes bread, then comes constitutional law, if you like. So it will have to come from below if we have any real belief in concrete change. But thank you.
Some more questions, just three, very quickly. Okay. Very quickly, please, you just, so much question. Very quickly, please. And here, yes, at the meeting. Você. Yes, he was the first, because we are on time.
Very quickly, I just wanted to thank all the professors that put this presentation together, and Professor Michael. It was an excellent lecture. And my question is very quick. I just wanted to know if you think that this democratic scenario that we have nowadays, the downfall of some democratic states, it is a process that's been building up since a lot of time ago, and it's going to inevitably reach an inflection point, thus needing to change the status quo? Or do you think that this is just a cycle, and we have to break the cycle to then improve the society?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the lecture. Forgive me for the pop reference. I don't know if you know the slasher franchise Scream. The slasher franchise Scream.
Scream?
Yes.
20 years ago.
So in Scream 3, there's a character, Gay Weather. She's portrayed by Courtney Cox, that says that pop culture is the 21st century new politics. And I love this idea because I research law and literature, so I like the connections between the arts and law. And in the context of the democracy crisis, do you think the cultural actors that are non-institutional and non-formal actors can take a key role in giving the directions of the political debate? Do you think that the arts can really be the arena where the greatest political debates will be fought in the century? I'm thinking like the Me Too movement and the discussion and legislative consequences regarding sexual harassment in the labor environment. In Brazil recently, a YouTuber posted a video about his critics on children adultization and sexualization and changed even the Congress agenda. I was just reading that lots of directors, actors, and producers signed an open letter asking for the Venice Film Festival to suspend Gal Gadot and Jared Butler for pro-Israel comments. So my question is in this sense. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one from Nayara, please.
So thanks for your lecture. This is really great. And I am thinking about this question since I started to read your text and think about it. You say that authoritarian liberalism is the combination of political authoritarianism and the realization of liberal economic objectives. So if we talk about authoritarian populism, sorry, I am a little nervous. We are talking about a period of economic capitalism that involves this populism or is not about it. And thanks once again.
Okay, thanks for these wonderful questions and difficult questions. Let me start by responding to the gentleman in the back. So the cover of the book, I don't know if you can see it from there, probably not, is the picture of the Angelus Novus by Paul Klee, which was acquired by Walter Benjamin, the German scholar, critic, who was very critical of German social democracy for believing in the inevitable story of progress. And for Benjamin, this was a fatal mistake. And Benjamin saw already in the late 1920s that fascism could eventually arise in Germany, and it could be a disaster of epic proportions. And the picture is depicts in Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history. This is the angel of history, and it's being blown into the future, revealing in its wake the destruction and death and torment and torture that is humanity's story. And he says this wind, ironically, is what we call progress. For Benjamin, this way of viewing history is fundamentally mistaken because human beings are capable of regression. Not only that, I think for Benjamin, this idea of rupture from the system might be as much of a revolutionary act as the idea of progression. And Benjamin says, and this is taken on by a Brazilian Marxist scholar, Michael Levy, I don't know if you're familiar with him, who says sometimes the most radical thing to do can be to pull the alarm, to pull the stop button on the train. In other words, and in particular in an era of potential environmental catastrophe, we shouldn't believe that we will necessarily, as a humanity, be progressing to a promised land. This in itself can be a naive and mistaken view. So I would say rather a rupture than a cycle than a straightforward line of progression. Cultural. Someone asked about the importance of literature and cultural actors, and they for sure play an important role in galvanizing opposition movements, in galvanizing social movements. Art and literature play an important role, but they cannot play an exclusive role. And I think that's again revealed by this insistence on the materiality of our lived experience. Me Too movements or whatever other movements can make an impact, but are they really changing the balance of power in society? Maybe for some, but for how many? and the majority still living in a system of oppression between men and women. So I would be skeptical that culture and art and literature, for sure they play a role, but they cannot play the only role, and they cannot play, I think, the fundamental role, which is changing the material conditions in which we live. Authoritarian populism. Yeah. So this is a tricky question, because if we look at the policies of the populists, they are often a curious mix. Sometimes a little bit of economic social policies are thrown in, often in a rather traditional way. For example, in Hungary, I can speak of the example of Hungary, where the social provisions are connected to traditional views of marriage or traditional views of men and women. So they are only very limited, if at all, going against a kind of traditional way of life. They're not really progressive in that sense. So populists are clever. Of course, they manipulate the system and use certain policies to attract a bigger electorate. But whether they fundamentally break from neoliberalism, I don't think so. I mean, this is a big question now. And it might be the case, for example, if we look at the most obvious of all, which is the case of Trump, that actually, although he's breaking from some of the norms of the so-called liberal order internationally, which was never that liberal, let's be honest. I mean, this is the other thing with the post-war period, which was a rose-tinted view of the history. I mean, but if we accept that Trump is breaking to some extent from liberal internationalism, domestically, there doesn't seem to be a great shift from a neoliberal economics policy. So we do have these strange mutations, but they're not breaking from the basic interests of capital, certainly domestic capital in the case of Trump. Perhaps internationally there are some shifts because of geopolitics, but I don't think that authoritarian populism is fundamentally opposite to authoritarian liberalism.
Thank you very much for the audience who stay with us until this time, and especially for Professor Michael, excellent lecture, and your availability to reply for several questions from us. Thank you very much.